Hi, I'm Ozzie Ostwalt, and welcome to Religion and Life. We're a month away from the 2016 election, and everyone's watching for issues and trends that might sway the way people vote. Does religion matter? You bet it does. Here to talk about the role religion might play in this year's vote are Drs. Tom Ellis and Sandy Gravitt. Welcome, both of you. Glad to have you on the show today. You're going to want to talk about something you're going to do in a couple of weeks. I think it's October the 18th. We're sponsoring a panel from the Department of Philosophy and Religion entitled Religion in an Election Year, I believe.
That's correct.
The two of you will be on the panel. You'll be delivering papers along with 2 or 3 other colleagues. And that is October the 18th from 5 to 7 p.m. in Belk Library 114. Is that correct?
That is correct, and everyone is welcome.
Great. We'll be looking forward to that. So public is welcome as well. So we want to explore today a little bit of what you'll be exploring with that panel. So this is a bit of a foretaste of what's going on. So the first question that really comes to my mind is about religion and election cycles is what role, if any, should religion play in a national election? And maybe, Tom, maybe you can address that first.
Happy to. And what I'll present on the 18th speaks to this. And I think one of the things we can ask, well, certainly we have a perceived separation of church and state. And I know our founding fathers suggested that we should keep religion out of the political sphere. But clearly religion influences people's behaviors and voting behaviors. And I'll at least raise the question, is this virtuous or is it a vice to include your position of faith when you start pulling levers in an election booth? And at least we can consider that faith is a private affair, even though we do have church communities. When we talk about faith, it seems to be a commitment to beliefs about the world and ultimate reality that don't enjoy empirical evidence or evidentiary support, or potentially even rational argument. Are there good arguments for a position of faith? Is there any empirical evidence support faith claims? Insofar as many philosophers that I know of suggest that that isn't the case, it raises some questions about how do we justify our voting behaviors, especially if our voting behaviors negatively affect another human being or another human community.
All right, so you're suggesting that faith, first of all, you're suggesting that faith is not rational.
I'd be willing to entertain an argument that faith is not a rational position.
So not being a rational position, I think I see where you're going with this. You're suggesting that it's perhaps not, it should not enter into one's decisions when it comes to voting, particular issues or candidates. Is that where you're headed here?
That's where I'm potentially headed.
Okay.
That when we start voting for potential candidates who may actually reflect our own religious beliefs. I mean, that's a possibility. But when religion is used to negatively affect another human community, I believe that human community has the right to demand a rational justification for that behavior. And if that's not forthcoming, well, I mean, we can still vote how we want to vote, but if that's not forthcoming, I see this as problematic for democratic citizenry.
All right, I want to get Sandy in on this, but let me ask you one quick follow-up here.
Sure.
So do you see that faith commitments then are different from other types of ideological commitments, say, I don't know, Marxism or feminism? Are you going to exclude those commitments too from the voting booth, or is religion a special category here?
I love the question. I think that's a great question. And I don't know if I have a definitive answer for that, but it does appear to me that many ideologies, especially if they're secular, will at some point try to fall back on some empirical evidence. So if you're a Marxist, I think history speaks to class warfares. If you're a feminist, I think there are plenty of opportunities to offer up empirical evidence that women are being mistreated either structurally or one case at a time. So I think when it comes to religion, it does seem to be peculiar in that it doesn't seem to have that same sort of claim to an empirical evidentiary base, or potentially even a rational argument.
Okay. All right, I want to hear from Sandy. All right, so Tom's given us a lot to think about here, questioning the rational basis of religion, questioning the validity of bringing one's religious commitments to one's voting commitments, and distinguishing religion from other sorts of ideological commitments when it comes to voting. What do you think, Sandy? Do you have a different take on this, or?
My focus in this particular panel is going to be less on if religion belongs in the voting booth, but how religion is influencing voter behavior.
So you're presupposing whether or not it belongs there, it's going to be there.
It's going to be there, and I am looking particularly at what we have called the values voter, and how that terminology is shifting and changing, because I think when you see most of this in the mainstream media, people are still making references back to the 1980s and 90s when they're thinking about the moral majority and the Christian coalition. And values voting is a different animal in this election cycle. In fact, we are looking far more at a constellation of issues that takes hold on the state level and is less influential in presidential decisions than it is in state and local decisions. And so where those issues are coming out, how they're expressing themselves in this particular election cycle is my interest.
Well, let's take one issue, since you took us back to the 80s and brought us forward. One of the big issues from the 80s, I think, would have been abortion, and the values voter might be identified as pro-choice or pro-life, and that was one of the big dividing issues.
Right.
Don't hear too much about that this time around, or I don't.
Unless you listened to the vice presidential debate last night.
Well, that's true.
The final exchange between the vice presidential candidates, Mike Pence made very clear his articulation of a culture of life, and it was an explicit appeal to these voters. And this is one way that I think we're seeing values voting. If you look at the Manhattan Declaration, which was put out a few years ago in the evangelical community, which caused a good bit of furor. I mean, abortion still was one of the issues. Even more so now, I think it's falling under the rubric of religious freedom, and where religious freedom is being practiced and how religious freedom is being practiced. And so I think you still see a conversation about a culture of life, which is more of the lingo these days, but even more because as the understanding of medical procedures and women's right to choose evolves in our culture, the language is changing. But even more, I think now what you're seeing is, do I have space in the public arena to practice my religion? And when you think about it constitutionally, if you're talking about the separation of church and state, it's really about the defense of the government will not interfere with the practice of religion.
Okay, so you're taking a different perspective on the First Amendment than Tom expressed a minute ago.
Right.
So,
or these voters are taking a different perspective.
Right, I got you, right. So what are the main values do you see? You click off 5 or 6 of 3 or 4 of the main values that are motivating voters in 2016, either at, as you said, the local level, state level, or maybe even more broadly speaking, the national level? Well,
I do still think that you are seeing particularly issues around marriage equality. You're seeing issues about the medical community and the so-called Obamacare provisions that would require companies to provide birth control, for example. And this is not just an evangelical voter anymore, but also very involved with the Catholic Church. And it stands on whether or not they can be forced to maintain insurance provisions that violate the tenets of the Catholic Church. Right. And so I think that's another one of the big issues that we see playing out. And then, of course, right to life decisions. Sure. I think these are the trifecta, probably.
Okay. Tom? Same issues, for better or worse. Are these issues that you see motivating people from a religious perspective? Are there others that are coming into play here that?
Well, I think certainly here in North Carolina, the kerfuffle, to say the least, over HB2. So in addition to what Sandy's suggesting, I think we have to realize that the LGBTQ community has a certain set of values that they're pursuing that we will see play out, especially here in North Carolina. Or at least I hope we do. And then, of course, we also see social concerns with the Black Lives Matter. And now I'm not sure how religion's going to affect that, but I do know, once again, here in North Carolina, we do have the NAACP, Reverend Barber, is playing the social gospel, social justice material or concerns that I think we'll see making some headway here in the election.
And I think that's a particularly important concern to highlight here in North Carolina with the Moral Monday movement and a pushback from a different perspective of religion, saying we need to be attentive to the material conditions in which people live. And so not just social issues are important, but it's not just social issues, it's also material conditions issues.
Okay. All right, let's broaden this a little bit, or I guess maybe narrow it down a little bit, more accurately speaking, to the national presidential election. Let's get a picture up there of our Democratic and GOP candidates, if you would, and then we can look at a couple of charts that indicate in some ways how religion might play out as people begin to make their decisions about voting. So here we have, of course, Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. And the Pew Research Foundation has provided some information. Let's get our first chart up here that help us to understand a little bit about how religion may be interacting in this year's vote. There's been some question about the religiosity of the candidates themselves, for example, and how that may play a role. If we get the first chart that we have here on our visual, then we can take a look at that. Here we're looking at a chart that delves into evangelicals who support Trump. We had a program a couple of weeks ago talking about this very issue. Normally, white evangelical voters are pretty enthusiastic about a GOP candidate. This year, it looks as if the evangelical vote is more against Clinton than for Trump, according to this data. Is there a comment there? Are the values, say, Sandy, of evangelicals not matching up with Donald Trump's values?
Well, I think what you saw in the Republican primaries was that Ted Cruz went full out for this population. He made the argument that a number of evangelical voters had sat out the 2012 election. That really doesn't bear truth. It doesn't bear out if you look at the evidence that they did actually vote for Mitt Romney in good numbers. But Cruz said, I am going to stake out this position as my own. And he had an evangelical following to some extent. But what I think this election cycle is demonstrating is that that was not what was driving the Republican base. And that so now it did not transfer over this evangelical movement into the Trump campaign as readily as we have seen in past election cycles, that the evangelical community fell behind McCain, they fell behind Romney. And one of the reasons has been some discomfort with the candidate himself. But what you saw was a shift in the polling after he announced potential Supreme Court selections, because this is one of the things that is driving this body or this community forward, is the division of the Supreme Court at 4-4 right now, the replacement of Scalia, who was a conservative voice on the Supreme Court. We've already seen a case where the 4-4 tie made them go back to the lower courts and say, figure it out with regard to religious freedom issues. And so I think that one of the things you're seeing is a distrust, particularly in how she will appoint Supreme Court justices. which has been a big issue for the evangelical
Okay.
community.
So, and that may go back to values then. So
Exactly.
it's just in a kind of a negative correlation here. Let's look at the second chart, if we could, which is indicative of the way voters perceive the religiosity of candidates. And of course, this goes back to the primary time. But you can see here that among the presidential candidates, voters don't see Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump as particularly religious in and of themselves. Tom, do you think that's an issue that is going to motivate voters, or I would guess that in your case you would see it as a completely irrelevant issue, perhaps?
Right. I mean, I'm looking at some of this for the first time here, and I tend to agree with the polling numbers. I don't tend to see Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton as terribly religious. I have sort of been interested in watching some of the evangelicals moving towards the Trump campaign, and it was interesting to see that graph where it was like they're really going for Trump because they're not voting for Clinton.
Right.
I'm not exactly sure what to make of this.
Yeah, well, it's interesting that more evangelicals are voting against Clinton than for Trump, according to the first graph. According to the second graph, evangelical voters are perceiving Donald Trump as even less religious than Hillary Clinton. So it's hard to make the case in my mind that values are what are really motivating the evangelical vote this time around.
Well, I think
unless it's a negative correlation. But
well, I think you do have to look at the fact that both candidates chose vice presidential running mates who shored up their credentials in this regard. Particularly Tim Kaine, who had worked with missionaries, who has been very active in the Catholic community, very well known for his sort of socially progressive Catholicism. Mike Pence, who has his track record in Indiana, who has, made his, I guess, maybe political life around some of these issues that are important to evangelical voters. And again, I go back to the debate last night with their final exchange, where both got to make their case in terms of how they saw the Constitution in that regard. And so that this has been farmed out to some degree to surrogates, which I think is also an interesting phenomenon. If both top of the ticket candidates are lacking in this regard, then you'll still have the appeal lower. That doesn't mean that they're not seeking those voting bases. I mean, I think you saw Trump recently going to African American churches. You've seen Hillary Clinton doing the same in Charlotte last week, and in talking to those communities. You've seen the thoroughgoing defense of someone like Paula White in Florida of Trump and his religiosity, calling him a baby Christian, testifying to the authenticity of his conversion. These are the elements that are out there for that community.
So one last question for both of you. It's pretty obvious that white evangelical voters are breaking for Trump in large numbers. Is there a block of values voters or, Tom, religious voters of a particular persuasion that can be identified breaking for Hillary Clinton?
I think that you do. I mean, I think that you will see Clinton garner some support, particularly, and this gets back to Tom's point, from the African American communities where she's polled very well, including amongst black evangelical voters. I think that her support in Latino communities, which are very Catholic traditionally, and Tim Kaine again appealing to that because he is also thoroughly versed in Spanish. But I think that you've seen those appeals, and I think that those voters look to be breaking Democratic, but that's not the basis on which they do. I mean, when you're going back to the motivation of voting behavior, I think that there's a difference between these communities which tend to vote in particular ways that are that rank other issues as more important.
So it may not just be values or religious issues.
Yeah, and so
which would probably make Tom happy. Just real quickly, we're about out of time here.
Sure.
But,
I mean, my thought always is that in some of these communities that appear that are more dispossessed than not, I just come back to the social gospel issue of some of these Black evangelical groups. There is a way of looking at some of the gospel messages as help the poor, reach out and care for those in need. And I dare say that this is not the message I don't think we're hearing from some of the Republican candidates as much.
But I do think that you are, when you're seeing where white evangelical votes are going to break, I think you are going to see, by and large, a really interesting core group that is concerned with things like Supreme Court nominations. And that's going to hold those votes.
Right.
Well, this is fascinating. We'll see.
Yes.
Before too much longer. So
Right.
thank you for helping us navigate some of these ideas about religion and the 2016 election. That's our program for this week. Thank you so much for joining us here on Religion and Life. And until next time, I'm Ozzie Ostwalt. Thank you so much. That was great.
Is that go okay?
Yeah.